She took her friend's shift at the coffee shop, unaware the customer she spilled coffee on was a CEO looking for a wife. "It's scorching hot coffee," Linda Lane said, voice trembling, gesturing helplessly toward the spreading stain on the man's expensive gray suit. Her hand hovered in midair as if frozen in time, clutching a stack of napkins she'd instinctively grabbed before realizing she shouldn't touch him. Her heart thudded wildly, echoing like a drum line inside her chest. The man before her, tall, commanding, with neatly parted dark hair and a crisp jawline, turned slowly, as though each second of delay was building to an eruption. I'm so sorry, sir. It was my fault. Please let me pay for the cleaning," she offered, her voice small but sincere. He stared at her, his jaw tightening, his entire frame rigid. "This is a $3,000 suit," he snapped, biting each word off as if tasting their bitterness. The cafe stilled. Every voice seemed to hush. Mugs halted mid-air. A baby's cry paused in curiosity. The warm golden light from the windows dimmed beneath clouds that moved in quickly, casting faint shadows over the barista counter where Linda stood, panic mounting in her chest. "Sorry doesn't clean Armani," he added, his tone ice-cold. Linda flinched. Her instinct to apologize again curled on her tongue, but she stopped herself. She took a slow breath, eyes briefly shutting against the burn of tears she refused to let fall in front of this stranger. Not today, not after everything else she had endured. When she looked up, her voice steadied, though still quiet. "You're right. If I could go back 5 seconds, I would, but I can't. All I can do now is mean it, and I do. I'm sorry." She held his gaze. Her cheeks flushed, her hair, once tied neatly, had fallen loose in the rush of the morning. There was no drama in her voice, no excuse, just plain regret. The man's expression faltered. Something in the way she stood, unapologetically sorry, not pathetic, made him hesitate. His anger, so ready to explode, cooled like steam lifting from a coffee lid. He exhaled and pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket, patting at the suit's lapel, the stark brown against the light gray wool. Linda watched, the air between them heavy with the kind of tension that could bend metal. He glanced at her name tag, Linda Tremont Cafe, and she straightened as he read it. He didn't know she had taken the shift for a sick friend, didn't know she'd been laid off from the library 3 weeks ago, didn't know she'd cried last night alone in a tiny studio, wondering how to pay rent, or that this job, this one chaotic barista shift, was all she had to grasp that morning. He didn't know any of it, but he saw something. He folded the handkerchief, nodded faintly, then pulled out a business card and placed it on the counter. "I'll have it cleaned," he said, his voice no longer biting. "Accidents happen." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Be careful next time. That was hot." Linda blinked. Her throat tightened as she nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you." He left. The glass door swung shut behind him with a soft hiss. She stood there, the card in her hand, watching the space he had filled a moment before. Something shifted inside her, some mixture of embarrassment, relief, and curiosity. Why hadn't he exploded? Why hadn't he called for her manager? Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter as she replayed the moment, his words, the flash of something softer behind his frustration. A few minutes later, she saw movement outside the window. He was still there. Standing beside the cafe awning, he pulled something from his pocket, his receipt. He scribbled on the back with a pen, folded it neatly, slipped it into his wallet, then disappeared down the street. Linda exhaled, confused by the hollow ache his absence left behind. Her coworker passed by. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said automatically. Then after a pause, "I think so." The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders, milk frothing and sticky syrup bottles, but her mind kept circling back to him, to the man with the ruined suit, who hadn't truly yelled, who had, in the end, extended a measure of grace. She didn't know his name, didn't know she'd see him again, didn't know that this small disaster would become the spark to a story far bigger than either of them imagined. But as she wiped the counter and helped the next customer, her hands no longer shook. Because that morning something had shifted, not just in him, but in her. And sometimes it takes one clumsy moment, one scalding cup of coffee, for the heart to finally start warming up again. Alan Walker sat alone in his corner office, on the top floor of Walker Enterprises, Boston's skyline sprawling behind him in quiet majesty. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, casting the late afternoon sun across the room in golden slants. But Alan barely noticed. His eyes were locked on a legal document spread across his desk. The words blurred as his jaw clenched tighter. A deadline. 60 days. That was all he had before everything he had worked for, his company, his legacy, was pulled from beneath him. Not because of failure, not because of market collapse, but because of a clause inserted into his father's will years ago, triggered now by the board. If Alan wasn't married by the end of the quarter, Walker Enterprises would merge with Blake International, his father's old rival, a hostile takeover disguised as a merger. Alan's hands curled into fists. He had spent the last decade reshaping the company from the ground up. Late nights, ruthless negotiations, sacrificing friendships, relationships, his own health. And now they were telling him he needed a wife to keep it all? He stood abruptly, the leather of his chair creaking behind him. Crossing the room, he looked out over the city, a sea of steel and possibility. He had been through every route. The elite matchmakers, heiresses, ambitious executives, influencers, and yet none had felt right. All of them saw the CEO, the fortune, the image. Not one had bothered to ask who Alan Walker really was beneath the suit. His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant, another cancellation for tonight's dinner match. Confirm reschedule? Alan stared at the screen for a long beat, then typed back, "No, cancel everything." He sat back down and leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. A wild idea stirred in the back of his mind, one that, until now, he had brushed aside as irrational. But desperation had a way of peeling back logic. What if he didn't need someone from his world? What if the right person wasn't on the guest list of some private event, but somewhere real, authentic? And then his mind returned to the girl at the coffee shop, Linda Lane, the blonde barista with wide, steady eyes and hands that had trembled but didn't beg. She had ruined his suit, yes, but she hadn't tried to win his favor. Her apology had been genuine, her dignity intact, and for reasons he still couldn't articulate, she had stayed with him all day. She didn't know who he was. That mattered more than he realized. Alan picked up the phone. "Carla?" he said when his assistant answered. "I want to set up a new assistant interview." Carla hesitated. "A replacement? You just renewed Maria's contract last week." "It's not about Maria. This is different. I want you to find the girl who works mornings at Tremont Cafe. Blonde, 20-something. I spilled coffee on my suit." Silence. Then cautiously, "Sir, are you suggesting we hire a barista?" "Set up a discreet interview," he said. "Bring her in as a temp, just for a trial period?" Carla paused again. "Understood." He hung up, fingers steepled under his chin. He knew it was reckless, unprofessional, possibly unethical, but he also knew this. In that chaotic moment at the cafe, for the first time in months, someone had looked at him and not seen a CEO. They saw a man with coffee on his suit. And somehow, that had felt honest. He didn't need someone to fit a mold. He needed someone who could see beyond it. Whether Linda would say yes to the offer, he didn't know. Whether she could play along long enough for the board to back off, even less certain. But one thing Alan Walker understood better than anyone else in the business world. Sometimes the best deals were made when you stepped outside the contract. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't part of a deal at all. Maybe she was the miracle clause he never saw coming. Linda Lane walked into the gleaming lobby of Walker Enterprises with a knot twisting in her stomach. She had no idea why she had been invited to interview for a temporary assistant role, especially when she had no corporate background and had submitted no resume. But the offer had come through a formal call, and her instinct, for some reason she couldn't name, had told her to say yes. She adjusted the collar of her borrowed blazer, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the top floor. When the doors opened, she was led into an office that looked more like a luxury suite than a workspace. Glass walls, curated art, and a view of Boston that stretched to the harbor. And there he was, the man from the coffee shop. Alan Walker stood behind his desk, hands clasped, expression unreadable. He didn't mention the coffee, didn't mention the incident. He simply nodded, then gestured to the seat across from him. "Ms. Lane," he said, "thank you for coming." "I still don't understand why," she replied, careful but not impolite. "I've never worked in an office. I'm not really—" She glanced around. I need someone who can think quickly, speak honestly, and who's not intimidated by a title," he said simply. Linda tilted her head. "You got all that from me spilling coffee on you?" A small twitch of amusement pulled at the corner of his mouth. "It was a memorable introduction." She blinked, then slowly smiled. "I guess it was." From that day, Linda became Alan's temporary assistant, but unlike anyone who'd worked for him before, she didn't try to impress. She didn't flatter. She didn't linger for approval. She asked direct questions. She challenged unnecessary tasks. She made coffee that was too strong and corrected him when he barked orders at staff without eye contact. "I know you're the boss," she told him once during a staff meeting, "but people work better when they feel seen." Alan had stared at her, speechless for a moment. No one ever spoke to him like that, and yet he found himself listening, changing. What he hadn't expected was how her presence began to affect the atmosphere of the entire office. Staff who used to whisper in the break room now smiled more. Meetings grew more efficient. Even his board noticed a shift. "You seem more approachable," one of them commented during a call. It wasn't deliberate, it was just Linda. She kept her head down, worked hard, and left promptly at 5 to visit the small assisted living home where her elderly godmother was recovering from surgery. She never bragged, never asked for anything. But one evening, Alan stayed late, reviewing merger documents, and found her curled up on a chair in the corner of his office, fast asleep. She had fallen asleep, with her head tilted, arms wrapped around her tablet, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He stood there, watching her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he walked to the closet, retrieved a light throw blanket, and draped it gently over her shoulders. His hand hovered for a heartbeat before pulling back. He turned off the lamp nearby and stepped quietly out, the door clicking shut behind him. Unbeknownst to him, his executive secretary had witnessed the moment from the hallway. The next morning, the office buzzed with whispers, not of gossip but admiration. The ruthless CEO had just proven he still had a heart. Linda awoke alone, the blanket tucked neatly around her, and a post-it note left on the desk. "Take the day off. Come back rested. A." She smiled, without meaning to, and something in her chest stirred. A warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Neither of them spoke about it when she returned the next day. But from then on, Alan started asking her opinion, not just on scheduling, but on people, decisions, presentation, and when she gave it, she didn't hold back. "I think your pitch deck is solid," she told him once, "but your language around small businesses sounds cold. You should lead with people, not numbers." He rewrote it that night. Alan Walker, a man known for his detachment and calculation, found himself seeking out the presence of a woman who had entered his life by accident, but nothing about what was growing between them felt accidental anymore. It started with longer hours. What began as a standard assistant role stretched into late-night strategy sessions, last-minute client dinners, and two-person brainstorms in Alan's office over takeout containers and open laptops. Linda adapted without complaint. She grew sharper, faster, more intuitive about what Alan needed before he even asked. And somewhere between spreadsheet edits and coffee breaks, the space between them began to shrink. They worked in sync, too well for it to go unnoticed. "Do you two ever disagree?" Carla, his executive secretary, asked once with a raised eyebrow. "Only about the definition of good coffee," Linda quipped, and Alan, standing behind her, chuckled. Their next trip was a 2-day business conference in Chicago. Alan typically traveled alone, but this time he invited Linda. Officially, she was there to take notes and manage his schedule. Unofficially, he wasn't sure he wanted to go without her. The flight was smooth, the meeting successful. The compliments rolled in from clients who noticed a new softness in Alan's tone, a new calm in his body language. "She's good for you," one investor said in passing. Alan had opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. He wasn't ready to define what this was, or what it could become. At the airport on their way back, the terminal buzzed with delays. Thunderstorms rolled across the East Coast. Flights were grounded, and tension hung thick in the air. That's when they heard the crying. A little boy, maybe 4 or 5, stood near a trash can, sobbing uncontrollably. No parent in sight. People passed him without stopping. Alan hesitated, but Linda was already walking toward the child. She knelt beside him. "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay? Are you lost?" The boy sniffled, nodded, wiped his face with a sleeve. "What's your name, Tyler?" "Okay, Tyler," she said gently. "We're going to find your mom, or dad, all right? You're not alone." She stayed with him, calming him, asking soft questions while Alan flagged airport security. Within minutes, a panicked mother came rushing over, crying as she hugged her son. Linda smiled and stepped back, her hand still gently resting on the boy's back until he was safe in his mother's arms. Alan watched the whole thing from a few feet away, something tightening in his chest. When they finally boarded the late flight home, the cabin lights were dimmed, and Linda fell asleep with her head against the window. Alan sat beside her, hands clasped, his thoughts tangled. The way she had spoken to that boy, patient, kind, natural. She hadn't hesitated, and hadn't even looked around to see if anyone else would help. She just moved, like someone who was meant to care for others. He stared at her profile, her blonde hair tousled against her cheek, her breathing even, and for a brief, foolish moment, he let himself imagine a future with her in it. Later that week, back in Boston, another storm hit. Offices closed early, but Linda stayed behind to help him finish a board report. Rain battered the windows. The city blurred behind glass. By 10, the streets were flooded. The subway stalled, and her phone buzzed with alerts. "You're not going out in that," Alan said firmly. "I'll call a cab. Linda, you'll stay here," he said, quieter now. "We've got a guest suite on the executive floor." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. Later, over leftover Thai food and soft jazz playing from his Bluetooth speaker, they sat on the office couch, the lights low, the storm muffled behind the glass. It felt strangely domestic, almost like home. Linda laughed at something he said, wiping a bit of sauce from her lip. He watched her, heart pounding for no logical reason. The air between them shifted. Then she looked up at him, really looked, and the room stilled. She leaned in slightly. So did he, their faces inches apart, breath shared, and then Alan stopped. He pulled back, barely. Linda blinked, confused. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, voice thick with something unsaid. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft, searching. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to, but something in him, guilt, fear, shame, coiled like a knot in his chest. She didn't know the truth, that this job had been a setup, that he hadn't hired her purely for her skills, that she was never just an assistant, not to the board, not to his plan. He didn't want the moment to be built on a lie. Linda leaned back slowly, smile fading just slightly. She didn't push, didn't ask. But something in her eyes changed, a flicker of uncertainty, and Alan felt it like a fracture in something fragile. He stared out at the rain, fists clenched in his lap, and knew the time for truth was coming soon, because his feelings were no longer part of the plan. They were real, and so was the risk of losing her. The office was quiet that Friday afternoon. Most of the staff had left early for the weekend, and the hum of rain against the windows made the space feel softer, more intimate. Linda had stayed behind to help organize the files Alan needed for Monday's board review. She sat at his desk, sorting through a stack of folders, when a notification pinged on his monitor. Alan had left for a quick call downstairs, and the email popped up innocently. A subject line in bold: Prenup draft. Plan B confirmation. Linda Lane. At first, she didn't register it. Her eyes skimmed, then locked in confusion. She opened the message, half expecting it to be a spam mail. But it wasn't. The sender was Alan's attorney. The message was brief, to the point, attached with a draft of a prenup agreement, and in it words that stabbed her in the chest. Should the original arrangement with Candidate A fall through, proceed to implement contingency agreement with Miss Linda Lane. Her employment and proximity provide a seamless transition into the required public narrative. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. She read the lines again. Plan B. Not love. Not even trust. Just convenience. The office suddenly felt colder. She stood, the chair scraping back behind her, heart pounding. She grabbed her bag, not caring about the mess left behind, and moved toward the elevator, but not before Alan stepped through the door. He stopped short, surprised. Linda, what's wrong? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes glistened, locked on his. You really thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you? She said, voice tight with fury barely contained. Alan's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? The prenup, she said flatly. The email from your lawyer. Plan B, Linda Lane. Alan froze. The silence between them was immediate and deafening. Linda, I can explain. No, she snapped, holding up a trembling hand. Don't do that. Don't insult me further by pretending this wasn't calculated. You hired me knowing exactly who I was. You tested me, observed me. You let me believe this thing between us was real. His face paled. It is real. It became real. She laughed bitterly. Right, after I passed whatever internal checklist you had for a wife, I was just convenient, accessible. Linda, that's not true. Then what is true? Her voice cracked. That I was second choice? That you chose me after someone else said no? Alan stepped forward, hands raised slightly, but she backed away. I let myself believe in you, she whispered. I defended you when people said you were cold, calculating. I thought they were wrong, but they were right. Linda, she cut him off, her eyes burning. You looked at me and saw a solution, not a person. I was just a plan, Alan. A plan you dressed up with late nights and gentle smiles and coffee runs. But it was always a lie. He was silent, his mouth slightly open, the weight of her pain landing like blows. I don't want your money, she said quietly. I don't want your apology. I don't want anything from you. Please, he said, the word raw. She shook her head, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. You don't get to say please. Not now. Then she turned. Alan didn't move. He didn't chase her. He stood there, rooted in the ruins of his own making, watching the only woman who had ever seen through his walls walk out of his life. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft chime, and he was alone. Alan Walker sat in his office with the blinds drawn and the lights off, the Boston skyline outside fading into gray dusk. For the past 3 days, he had barely spoken a word to anyone. Meetings were postponed, emails went unanswered. He stared at screens, at documents, at contracts, but nothing registered. She was gone. And for the first time in his life, Alan didn't care about deadlines, boardroom power plays, or even the empire he'd built with blood and sweat. Without Linda, none of it meant anything. Her words haunted him. You looked at me and saw a solution, not a person. But she had been right. He had hired her for a reason. And then somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing her as a reason and started seeing her as the only thing that felt real in his entire world. And now she was gone. He found himself walking the city in the rain, no umbrella, no destination. He ended up on Tremont Street, standing in front of the little cafe where she had spilled coffee on his suit all those weeks ago. It looked just the same. Warm lights, humming espresso machines, baristas calling out orders over the quiet jazz in the background. Alan stepped inside and sat at the corner table near the window. No one recognized him. He ordered a black coffee and said nothing more. And then he sat there, every day for a week, arriving at 10, leaving at 4. He watched the door each time it opened, hoping, aching, for Linda to walk in, ponytails swaying, apron tied, eyes lit with that quiet fire that had first disarmed him. She never came. On the 7th day, he left a $20 bill under his cup and walked to the nearby park. He sat on a bench, staring at the ducks on the pond, wondering how he had let something so rare slip through his fingers. That night, he went back to his penthouse and opened the prenup email again. He read every line. The legal language was cold, transactional, proof of how far he had strayed from anything resembling sincerity. He closed the laptop. Then he pulled a blank sheet of paper from his desk. He wrote his resignation by hand. By morning, it was signed and delivered to the board. The room erupted in disbelief when he presented it. "You're walking away from everything," one member snapped. "Alan, this company is your life." "No," Alan said calmly. "It used to be." "What about the merger, the terms?" "I'm breaking them," he said. "Let it merge, let it burn, I don't care." Another member leaned forward. "All because of a woman?" Alan smiled sadly. "No, because of the man I became trying to hold on to something built on lies." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and added, "If I can't have her with truth, then I don't want anything built on a lie." He walked out of that boardroom without looking back. Later that day, he returned to the cafe once more. He ordered her favorite drink, vanilla chai latte with almond milk, and sat alone in the corner, just like always. The barista behind the counter eyed him with curiosity. "You keep coming here?" she said. "Looking for someone?" Alan looked up, eyes wary but kind. "Yeah," he said. "Someone who taught me more in 3 months than I learned in 34 years. She must have been special." "She is." The bell above the door chimed. He looked up, but it wasn't her. Still, he waited. Because that's what people do when they finally learn what love means. They wait, they hope, and when necessary, they let go of everything else to make room for what truly matters. The smell of old pages and quiet rustle of book spines had always been a comfort to Linda. After everything, after her godmother's passing, the whirlwind that had been Alan Walker, and the storm that followed, she found herself back at the public library on Commonwealth Avenue, volunteering again. She shelved books, helped elderly readers find novels they half remembered, read to children in the sunlit reading room. Her heart was quieter now, bruised, still healing, but quieter. That afternoon, as she stepped outside to lock up, she saw him. Alan stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, rain softening the sharp lines of his expensive jacket. He looked different, less polished, more human. His eyes, when they met hers, held no arrogance, no expectation, just ache and honesty. Linda didn't move. He crossed slowly, never breaking eye contact, and stopped a few feet away. "Hi," he said, voice low. "Hi," she replied, arms wrapped around herself. "I know I shouldn't be here," Alan continued, "but I needed to say something. Not to fix anything, just to tell the truth." Finally, she said nothing. "I was scared," he admitted. Terrified, actually. Not of the company, not of the board, but of letting someone get close. I thought if I controlled everything, even love, I could avoid getting hurt. Linda's expression didn't change, but she didn't walk away either. "I created a script," he said. "I thought if I found someone who didn't know me, I could shape the story the way I needed it. But then you walked in and nothing followed the script anymore. You were real. You were everything I didn't know I needed, and everything I didn't deserve." Linda blinked slowly. "I kept telling myself I'd explain, that I'd find the right moment to tell you the truth. But the longer I waited, the more I feared I'd lose you. And in trying to keep you, I ended up pushing you away anyway." He reached into his coat pocket. "I kept this," he said, holding out a small, folded slip of paper. "It's the receipt from the day you spilled coffee on me. I don't know why I held on to it. Maybe because I knew even then that something had started. She took it with hesitant fingers, unfolding it. On the back, in neat handwriting, he had written, "The best mistake of my life. If you still remember, I'll be waiting at the same table." She looked up, eyes swimming. "I'm not asking for anything," Alan said softly. "I'm not here to win you back or beg. I just wanted you to know I left the company. I walked away from everything that was built on lies, because I finally understood what I really wanted, what was worth keeping." He smiled, sad and hopeful all at once. "And if you don't come, that's okay. You don't owe me anything. I just hope you'll remember that day and know that I'll be sitting there, just in case." He stepped back, giving her space, and walked away without turning around. Linda stared at the receipt in her hands for a long time. Her fingers trembled. She pressed the paper to her chest, and the next morning, just as the cafe doors opened and the bell above chimed softly through the warm air, she stepped inside. She looked toward the corner table. He was there, and this time he wasn't holding a script. He was simply waiting, with truth in his eyes and hope in his heart. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Alan stood immediately. Linda had just stepped inside. She wore a soft blue coat, her hair tied back simply, cheeks touched by the morning chill. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. The noise of the cafe faded. All he could hear was the rhythm of his own breath and the hope pounding behind it. He nodded toward the table. "I was hoping you'd come." Linda smiled, quiet and unsure. "I wasn't sure until this morning." "I understand," he said. May I get you a coffee?" She raised an eyebrow, amused. "Only if you promise not to spill it this time," he chuckled, relieved. "Deal." He turned to the barista and picked up the to-go cup he had requested earlier. It was plain except for a small heart doodled on the lid. Alan brought it back carefully, setting it in front of her. She looked at him curiously. "You're giving me coffee? To go? Just open it," he said, voice soft. She pulled the lid off. Inside, nestled among a folded napkin and a small slip of paper, was a simple velvet ring box. Linda froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it. Alan dropped to one knee, right there beside the table. The cafe fell into silence. The barista paused mid-pour. A little girl at the counter whispered, "Is he proposing?" Alan looked up at Linda, his heart in his throat. "I don't want a wife for business," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion. "I don't want contracts or arrangements. I don't want someone perfect on paper. I want you for life." He took a breath. "You challenge me, you see me, and somehow, even after everything, you still came back. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that." Linda blinked quickly. Tears filled her eyes. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Alan rose as the cafe erupted in applause. Some patrons stood, clapping. One couple near the window whistled. The barista rang the bell twice and shouted, "Free coffee all day, in honor of true love." Alan laughed, slipping the ring onto her finger. Linda looked down at it, then at him, still smiling through her tears. "I guess this was the best cup of coffee after all," she murmured. Alan leaned in and kissed her, soft and reverent, and in that little cafe on Tremont Street, where mistakes had once brewed with lattes and spilled espresso, their real story finally began. Thank you for watching this unforgettable story of love, redemption, and second chances. From a spilled cup of coffee to a heartfelt proposal, Alan and Linda's journey reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from the most unexpected accidents. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. We bring you the tales that heal, inspire, and remind us all of the magic still waiting in ordinary moments. See you in the next story, where the heart always leads the way.